Welcome, Deepti, to Fully Booked. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Megan, for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, it's a thrill for me because it's not often that I come by a book such as yours. I hear a lot of words used to describe this book, all good, exciting and propulsive, cinematic, family saga, The Godfather meets The Great Gatsby. I like that one. Crime thriller. Okay. How have you come to regard Age of Vice as its author?
That's a really interesting question, Megan, and I'm really glad you've asked it because the thriller thing is also interesting for me. And I think when I was speaking with editors, when the initial manuscript had been sent to them, they were all saying, this is a great book because it defies genre. And no one ever used the word thriller. I mean, it was always propulsive, thrilling. But I think what happens is then there's a publishing machinery that comes into place. There's, people who decide that it's a thriller. And so it's interesting that it's sort of started to slip into that thriller genre. And I think that it can be a thriller. I mean, it starts off with a car crash. There is a mystery at the heart of it. But if you come to it for pure genre thrills, I'm not sure you're going to walk away feeling entirely satisfied. It starts off as a thriller, but then it becomes something much more. And what do you think?
I agree. I mean, come for the thrills, stay for the richness of the world because you're giving me everything. I enjoyed the humor of Nida's father in this too. I got everything. I've got comedy, drama, action, adventure, everything I want in a novel and more. So thank you for it.
Well, yeah. And again, really happy that you picked up on Neda's father. He's one of my favorite characters. He's like a fantasy father, I just love him. He's just waiting for her to come back home. And then he's like, let's have some vodka.
He was one of my favorites for sure. But I will be remiss if at this point we don't backtrack and introduce Neda and also Ajay and also Sunny Wadia, who are the kind of the three biggest stars in the constellation of this novel. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
So would you kindly, for the benefit of our listeners who haven't had the pleasure of dipping into this book yet, please introduce the three?
Oh, okay. I thought you were doing it. No, I'll do it. No, I just. Okay, so Ajay, let's start with Ajay. Ajay is the heart of the novel, and we meet him when he's a young boy who comes from a very poor family in Eastern UP. His father dies tragically, and he is sent off by his mother to work in the mountains in India, in the Himalayas, in order to pay off a family debt. And he grows up on a dairy farm. And then his employers were actually quite kind. Also, eventually, I don't want to give away too much, but he starts to work in a cafe after he stops working for that couple. And that's when he meets. He's about 17, 18. He meets Sunny now and ends up going to work in Sunny's house. Sunny is the son and heir to a massive fortune, a business family that exists in the gray area between being gangsters and businessmen. His family, the Wadias, they live in Delhi. Ajay makes his way there. He starts to work for Sunny first as a kind of butler, a day boy, and then he becomes a night boy. And he basically starts to work. He gets promoted. He becomes Sunny's Man Friday. And Sunny is this ambitious, young, very dapper young man when we meet him in Delhi. He's a bit mysterious. He's just sort of like very wealthy. He's basically stormed the social scene in Delhi. He's a benefactor of the arts. Everyone's wondering about him. Everyone's wondering where his money comes from. And into this scene steps Neda, who is a young, curious, and naive journalist who basically falls in love with Sunny while also investigating or being part of an investigation into his family.
Yes. And so it's very interesting because they're fully fleshed. They're everything you want. They're so individual. You immediately want to know more about the story of these three. And each of them has a quite different vantage on this rarefied world. I would say, by way of making our way in conversation, one thought that's been traveling around with me is that though they are very individualized, these three characters do represent kinds of people or types of people as well. Sunny, for example, he's the son of a powerful man, and his father kind of represents this big man sort of character. Ajay is kind of like, is this person who is not born to power and privilege, in fact, is born to a family outside of the caste system, is considered, a chauffeur, a boy, a helper, somebody who should move through unseen, but know everything that those, who he serves want in real time, basically like that. And I was kind of just trying to understand what inspired your exploration of these types of characters.
Well, the way I work is that all my characters are inspired by my life, or my travels and my life in India in the last 20 years. So Sunny is like boys that I grew up with. I was sent to a boarding school when I was very young. So I sort of grew up with the sons, as you said, of powerful men. I saw them grow up from being kind of kids who didn't really know anything, but except for the fact that they had a lot of family wealth. And then they grew up into these privileged young men, wayward, disaffected. Sometimes they were sent abroad to study. In the early 2000s, in the early aughts, liberalization and the economy was liberalized. So a lot of business families in India found that their wealth was supercharged. So a lot of these young men who were already quite wealthy suddenly found themselves really, really wealthy. And so rupee millionaires, rupee is the Indian currency, became dollar millionaires or multimillionaires. And that was really interesting for me to watch this supercharged wealth. And I had because I had grown up with them, I had this insider view into their world. Ajay is inspired by two people, actually. So the little boy is someone that I actually met when I was traveling in the mountains, a very sweet, optimistic young boy who was working in a guest house, told me a family story about being sent away to pay off a debt. I remember that when I heard his story, I immediately had found the novel that I had been thinking about for the last many years, because I combined it with the story of the young men that I used to see working in these fantastically rich houses in Delhi. Invisible, basically there to serve, there to make sure that every need was catered for, especially at night when you had these big parties, these kind of like Gatsby-like parties. And they were always there. And of course, they weren't invisible, but they were trained to be invisible. And I always wondered about them. And I remember that when I met the young Ajay, I was able to just think, okay, there's my novel. That's how I'm going to start. So even though it's a type, and he is the sort of oppressed everyman, I wanted to write him because it was about the expendability of these lives, of these young men who have no opportunities, but who are extremely loyal.
Yeah. And I'm very interested. And of course, Neda, you give a profession to her journalist. It's one you've practiced several years yourself in Delhi, is my understanding. I'm very interested identity-wise, how you as an author, as a novelist, how you think about yourself as a journalist, as a writer, as an author, how these things are all dovetailing, because the beautiful answer you've just given kind of points me towards an understanding of it's kind of like, it seems like a journalist's way into a novel.
Yeah. Well, I was a journalist, again, as you said, in my 20s in Delhi. I wasn't a very good journalist.
Oh, come on.
No, but I think that what's bad for journalism can be good for novel writing. In that I never really doggedly pursued a story. And I could give that to Neda, the fact that she's not a very good journalist either. But I did spend all those years driving around, just listening to stories, people talk, just giving me their stories. And I have an extremely open, curious mind. And I'm just very non-judgmental, and people just tell me things. And that really helped. For Neda, I always find it useful to put a spine of extremely personal experience into the writing. It just sort of supercharges it sometimes and makes it more powerful. With Neda, I transplanted my incessant driving and my journalism, but I gave her fantasy address and fantasy parents. I came, I lived in an extremely unfashionable part of the city. I had I had more socially conservative parents. So, and for me, Neda represents, and why I used her, journalism is also a great exposition. I mean, it's like if you want to tell the story of the city, why don't you just have a journalist doing it? And it helped that I was a journalist, and I was kind of like watching the way the city changed. Early aughts in Delhi was, again, we were seeing the fruits of economic liberalization. Suddenly it felt like a very sleepy, sedate city was being charged with money, with ideas, with, like there was an arts and culture scene that suddenly felt like it had changed. Delhi always had this kind of bohemian scene, but now there was money that flowed into it. And it wasn't just the arts and culture. It was socially, economically, everything was changing around us. You were getting, and everything was being built at that time. So that was just a really interesting time. I happened to be there at that point of time. And that's also why I wanted to set my novel then.
It's definitely, harking back to the beginning of the answer when we were talking about your time as a journalist, listening to people, going out, meeting with people, hearing different voices, recording that, imbuing your fiction with that. I think that part of what lends propulsion to the novel, at least for me as a reader, is the dialogue, which is very snappy and sounds pitch perfect.
Thank you.
I was wondering if maybe this is a weird question, but like, what do you see as potentially as tools of propulsion? Like I see some shorter sentences, right to it, some swaths of dialogue, those lend themselves to it. Do you see other markers of that yourself?
I've been trying to think about that. And I think it's because I write visually. I think in terms of almost cinematic visuals, and then I translate that to prose, and that could be it. But it's also really hard to know. But a lot of it is just instinct and practice. I always knew that I wanted to write a story that you could just start reading and then it just keeps moving, and then it doesn't let up till the very end. That's the intention. But whether you actually achieve that is another question altogether. So yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I thank you just for playing with me on that, because sometimes I feel like I ask impossible questions. I wouldn't want to be on the other end of the microphone, and that's why I do what I do. I like to ask the questions, but it's just fun to puzzle them out together. So thank you for that.
No, it's something I've been thinking about as well. So
I would say the achievement was unlocked because it was a story I didn't want to stop reading. But I recently learned, it is my understanding, that it's not a story I do have to stop reading, because this is the first of a trilogy, correct?
Yeah, I had a lot of material that I hadn't used, and Ajay's journey hadn't ended. So that's all going to go into the next few books. Also, I wanted to jump forward a bit in time and set it in a kind of more contemporary India.
That's very exciting. Will you expand beyond the geographical area you've covered in this book, or is it going to be concentrated in the same places?
A little bit. It's mostly going to be concentrated in North India. Some of the action will unfold in a place called Ladakh, which is a high altitude desert valley in the Himalayas with wild dogs and feral dogs and Buddhist monasteries. It's very bleak and beautiful. But a lot of the action will take place around Delhi and UP and Punjab.
I could just see it in your description there. That makes me want to return to the word cinematic. It is my understanding that in addition to immediately selling this book in like 20 countries around the world, the rights were sold to FX for series development.
Mm-hmm, that's right. Yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, please expand on that. Beyond exciting, how does that feel to know right off the bat, boom, grand slam, and that you're actually going to see these characters come to life and, through these actors and this production?
I think the early interest by FX was just, it felt like a great endorsement of the storytelling and the world. And I'm actually adapting it with my husband at the moment. We're working on the pilot. I've also learned that the process is very slow and very collaborative. So it's taking its own sweet time. But what is very interesting and exciting about it is that I have the world of the book, but there was so much more. There were so many scenes that, I didn't use for the books. And all of those scenes can go into the TV show. So it's like there's this whole sections that can now just be there. And it can be different as well, while also being, obviously you're in the world. It's a similar world. It's the world of the Wadias and Ajay, but you can just adapt it differently. So it's a very exciting process.
Are you always a maximalist in your writing? Do you write long and big and cut down, or?
Yeah, I do. I don't want to be, but my first novel was tiny, but this one, for some reason, it was actually way longer, and I edited it down. I'm hoping that the next one isn't as long, to be honest, but I don't know where it'll go. So my process is also quite unpredictable, even to myself.
I like a little bit of mystery myself. What's your proudest achievement craft-wise? This is your second book. Did you just nail something that really made you sing?
I haven't thought about that. No, because I always feel like I could have done better. There's always like what's in your head, and only maybe a little percentage of that goes on the page. So no, I don't think there is anything that I can say with confidence that this was amazing. You can always know you can do better.
I feel just the same as you do. The conversation, I could have said this, I could have asked this, I could have written a profile differently. I was just interviewing an author, Lee Bardugo. We were waxing poetic about the different types of labor and how sometimes, you can do a form of labor that's either, making up somebody's face or preparing a beautiful cup of hot coffee. And like, it's a contained labor, but with your art or your conversation or what have you, you could always go back and worry it to pieces.
Yeah. When you're writing, it's like you keep worrying about what you could have done better. But when you have, for example, if you're just running a restaurant, or not just running a restaurant, which is very, very hard work, but if you're a chef, I know lots of chefs, or a bartender, you just have to create that perfect meal or make that perfect drink. And then it's over, and you can go to bed at night happy and wake up the next morning and start again. But with writing, you never go to bed happy.
I fantasize a lot about that sometimes. What else would you like our listeners to know about Age of Vice?
Well, we've already covered this, but it starts off like a thriller, but then it goes into many different places. And I think that's really important for people to know. And that it's a novel about contemporary India as well, and politics. And it's about power and corruption and abuse of power and complicity. Especially with Neda's character, I really wanted to explore the idea of complicity and compromise in Delhi, because it could be anywhere. As a middle-class Indian with privileges myself, I feel like I accounted for my years of privilege and excess by writing this novel. And the same thing for Neda. It's like, I wanted to explore that idea. There's like the rich are choosing to compromise their morality in order to live in Delhi, which is this brutal place. And everyone just wants a little bit of comfort at the end of the day. The poor are made to compromise. So maybe one day they get rich themselves. And that was really what I wanted to explore, the extremes of life.
Well, we've got the extremes of life. We've got action, adventure. We've got dialogue. We've got levity. We've got everything you want packed into one very big, rich, wonderful book. Thank you so much, Deepti, for joining me today on Fully Booked to discuss Age of Vice.
Thank you, Megan. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.